Hi, I'm Kevin Werbeck, professor of legal studies and business ethics at the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania. For decades, I've studied emerging technologies, from broadband to blockchain. Today, AI is promising to transform our world. But AI needs accountability, mechanisms to ensure it's developed and deployed in responsible, safe, and trustworthy ways. On this podcast, I speak with the experts leading the charge for accountable AI. Today's guest is Tanvi Singh, a longtime financial services technology leader who's now focused on building sovereign AI solutions. We talk about what AI sovereignty means beyond control of data and locations of data centers, the connections between sovereignty and accountability for AI, where domain models will gain traction versus broader large language models, and how AI sovereignty is potentially a bridge across ethics, regulation, governance, and brand alignment for AI. Tanvi, pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so much for joining me on the road to accountable AI.
Thank you for having me. This is actually my first public conversation since coming out of stealth for Ekta, our sovereign AI platform company that I co-founded. And I think this is the right forum to do it because Ekta was born directly out of the accountability problem. So very excited to be on the podcast with you.
So let's start with the backstory before we get to what you're doing now and the sovereign AI work. You spent a number of years in financial services, places like Credit Suisse, UBS, very regulated, risk-sensitive environments for dealing with AI and other new innovations. Can you talk about your experience in that world and how that shaped how you think about some of these AI governance issues?
No, absolutely, Kevin. I spent over 2 decades building and governing large-scale data and AI systems inside highly regulated industries, global banks, public interest organizations, pharmaceuticals. And in those environments, AI isn't experimental. You're accountable to regulators, citizens, markets, history sometimes. And when systems fail, there is no abstraction layer to hide behind, right? So it's not about drawing pictures or creating audios or making videos. It's true accountability. So when I saw repeatedly that is most AI systems today are very powerful, right? But externally controlled, institutions consume intelligence through models they don't own, data they don't govern, and inference processes they can't always explain. And that create a structural issue because you can't be accountable for decisions you do not control. And that was a need, and that was the reason why, of the last couple of years, ever since I left UBS, I tried to hone into the problem, looked at different investments, different companies across the globe. And when I did not find one that could exactly solve the problems of the regulated industry I've been part of, I co-founded Ekta with my other co-founders. One of them, ex-Microsoft architect who has built up the Microsoft Fed before. So he is the one who was part of the sovereign AI build in the early 2020s before sovereign AI became a topic of conversation in our regular discussions today.
So for those who aren't familiar, maybe describe what sovereign AI means.
It's a very interesting question. Sovereignty is what makes accountability real. So for sovereign AI, as we understood it, was sovereignty with infrastructure, right? So G42 and many organizations said that we want to keep the infrastructure with us, where our data would reside within our own infrastructure, so we can control, our information, which is our biggest asset. In terms of our operation as a sovereign nation. We in banking have seen sovereignty in a way that we did not put all of our data onto the cloud. I remember the back and forth I had with all my business partners to say it's more effective to put your data onto a cloud. It's more cost effective to do so, but a lot of those data could not be put onto the cloud because of the sensitivity of that data. So think about nations, think about organizations like banks and any other regulated industry. Data is your most precious asset. So for the longest time, sovereignty was about where do you put your data? Now, fast forward Gen AI, you could do a lot with the data, and the LLMs came in. The OpenAI, Microsoft were very good partners, and UBS has been a very good partner. So we saw the evolution of what happened with the LLMs. But with the large language models, you have to give away your data to either to the RAG or to the training of the data in order for that LLM to be effective in your organization. The moment you put your data into a large language model or an open source model, you lose the sovereignty of that data because you do not control how that model is formed, governed, secured, and henceforth run. So, in the total concept of sovereignty, it is the control of your infrastructure, it's control of your data, it's control of your models, and how do you govern and run those models. So, in a nutshell, if I were to say that I am the owner, I am the leader of an organization, this system should reflect my value, my laws, my culture, and one that I can prove it. And if you could do that, then you have a sovereign infrastructure.
But in this generative AI era, there are only a limited number of frontier labs that can build these truly leading foundation models. So doesn't that push away from an environment where each deployer of AI is going to have total control of their own infrastructure?
It's a very fair question. Counterintuitively, no. As domain specific models have proven over and over again, and we have seen that in the more regulated healthcare industry, that they are often more accurate and far more cheaper. So, if your intention as an organization is not to have one Einstein in your pocket that can do everything for you, and in that case, you should be working with the frontier models, to your point. But your intention is to have that one employee that's the best in class employee for you in an organization who is an expert in your organization, your data, and your topic. Then domain specific models turn out to be much more accurate towards your respective benchmarks, much more secure, and you wouldn't believe it, a lot more cheaper because you're
Mm.
not churning the whole inference of an LLM. So I say it, you don't need a bazooka to kill a fly. And most of the time in organizations, all we are trying to do is to kill a fly in the focus of the activities that you're responsible for. So domain specific models are the ones that can be more effective and does not need to be state of the art that can solve every single problem that you associate with when you look at the frontier models.
Just an aside, not a big thing. We'll cut this out, but I think you're bumping the table a little with your hand as you're talking, which I do
Aha.
that too, which
Okay.
I'm picking up a
Yes.
little on the mic. Well, again, the editor will pull it out, but just if you can, not a big thing, but I'm hearing a little bit of background noise there. Okay.
Okay. Yeah. I keep that in mind now. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, good. Okay. Yeah. Um, can you drill down on what exactly is the challenge that calls for that sovereignty? Because I can understand a company saying, I'm worried about security or access to my data. Certainly, many companies are worried about the queries and the prompts that they use getting used to train large language models. But if you've got an enterprise contract with an OpenAI or a Gemini or something like that, that's presumably going to restrict what they can do in terms of using the prompting. So where exactly is the problem that organizations are finding not having the sovereignty?
So, one of the latest news that came out last week was the acting head of legal for President Trump has been using ChatGPT for a lot of very sensitive legal data for the US government. And I think that article in itself is a much better articulation of the problem to the question you just talked. Because as long as we say the frontier models are all safe and secure onto our platform, the moment you sent over any sensitive documents through that interface, it becomes part of the training corpus of that frontier model.
Mhm.
So that's where it's absolutely okay if I'm trying to arrange for a travel on a private level, if I'm trying to learn a language, if I'm using this for anything and everything to get myself educated on. So that's where the frontier models are extremely helpful, are extremely powerful, and have become the basic part of our lives because we have every teacher, every expert in the room that we can talk to. But when it comes to regulated topic, regulated industry, national secrets, then those frontier models become a challenge on the other side because you could not use those frontier models for your very sensitive information that by default it becomes a training corpus. So that's a challenge that most of the leaders of organizations that care about patents, care about IP, care about the sensitivity of information about their clients are not using large language models for any external client-facing use cases. Most of the LLMs in the frontier models that you see or the organizations are still used for operational topics internally dealing with non-sensitive data. And in order to change the equation, in order to have more sensitive topics, more high-value use cases to be implemented, which obviously include a lot of sensitive information, the need for domain-specific models makes a very strong play.
Should every organization be looking to having this sovereignty, or is this primarily an issue either for big companies or regulated companies?
So, brand alignment, Kevin, becomes another topic, right? We talk about private data just before, but brand alignment becomes a topic. So, few of our existing pilot design partners and clients we speak with are very interested in working with us on sovereignty, on domain specific models, because they would want their values, their laws, their culture to be reflected as the brand alignment of the models. So sensitivity remains to be one. Number two is use cases around brand alignment. So if you're a PR company and if you do a lot of work around relationships, then again, building a model that speaks your language and not the language of the internet, which is typically what a large language model, a frontier model is, it again becomes a use case. So it depends on what you care about. If you are a school and you care about teaching different languages to your student, any model would work. Um, if you are a PR organization and you have a huge brand value and you want to create a use case that is your client facing use case, you would consider a domain specific model. And then I guess we have definitely talked about sensitive regulated industries and sovereign states who care about sovereignty and henceforth would look at sovereign domain specific models as well.
As you said, you're creating a company, Ekta, that's working in this area. Can you explain more specifically what it is that you're building for this vision of sovereign AI?
So what we're building is a platform that has four different layers that takes care of the data ingestion, pre-training the model itself, and the final layer that takes care of security of your data as the four-layered platform. And this is a platform that can be deployed into any infrastructure that you consider sovereign. So in many use cases, we've heard private cloud platforms within Microsoft, Google to be sovereign as defined by the clients. Or on the other side, we have worked with other design partners who think about air gapped environments to be sovereign, which it truly is sovereign. So depending on what your definition of sovereignty is, we can embed our platform into that infrastructure and then can use your data to train the model from scratch and can build any kind of application on top, which is viable and useful for you across the industries. And that is what we do as a license, a bigger license and a smaller services set of opportunity towards our clients.
Do organizations know now what their definition of sovereignty is? Do you have to educate them to think about those different approaches?
That's a great question, Kevin. My co-founder was the CTO of a company previously, started in 2023, and they were pioneering the exercise of domain-specific models. So when they went to potential clients, I was absolutely trying to do an education from scratch. So they had a lot of people experimenting with them, but it was a very hard take with regulated industry and also with governments to work with. But they got acquired last year by Cisco, which was a great exit and a proof point of how great the technology is, because eventually now in 2026, it doesn't need a lot of education. We are starting to see more and more enterprise, more and more regulated industry coming and talking to us and doing pilots and demos because they understand it's not just the sovereign play, it's also the domain specificity that gives them the benchmarks of accuracy. And more importantly, the cost of running the model, the cost of inference becomes a lot cheaper when working with a domain model than while running a bigger LLM. So when 2026 is all about applications, is all about productivity, is all about accountability, we find ourselves to be in a much better space that regards clients and their education and their knowledge about what sovereign domain specific models can do for them.
I guess what I was getting at was also, as you mentioned, if for some people, if it's in the cloud, it's not within your sovereign control. For some people, it is, there's no bright line because obviously there are trade-offs at every point. So are organizations comfortable making those decisions? And obviously, if we're talking about a highly regulated or national security use cases, or they've got a whole established practice, but I would assume there's a lot of companies that uh, this vision appeals to them, and they have exactly the needs you're describing, but they've been so used to thinking in these terms that everything is outsourced that they're not really at the point of understanding. So I'm just curious if that's an issue that you're seeing, or if there's already that awareness in the market.
So the awareness does come. I think Europe and
Mm.
other nations, you would assume, would be more aware of what sovereignty is about. But we are seeing more and more of traction just in Americas, within different
Ugh.
states in America, around the call for sovereignty. So for a lot of organizations, and speaking to a few nations in Africa, it is about sovereignty in its true essence, and having
Mhm.
control as a nation about their data, and not giving that information away in the hands of either an American frontier model or a Chinese open source model. So it's the pure definition of sovereignty. But as I said, a lot of organizations that we are speaking in Americas also do not want to give a lot of their data to the American frontier models. So we've
Mhm.
seen a lot more awareness on domain models, which wasn't there till about mid of last year. People still needed to be educated of why domain model is going to be better than Microsoft, which they have been working with as a Microsoft license for over decades. But not everyone, to your point, Kevin, but many. I think more than enough that we could cater to in terms of our services have been much more aware on the concept of sovereignty, the concept of domain model, and the cost of running these models to be productive with AI. Because I guess the point in time where people were piloting, and by people I mean organizations, not
Mhm.
individuals. We as individuals are much more mature on using AI, most of us. But organizations have still been piloting and still been testing on what the art of the possible is. But I see 2026 to be a year where a lot of these experiments are going to get real. So technologies like us
Mhm.
have become part of the value chain that they are evaluating.
Usually when people talk about sovereign AI, they start with uh, physical location of data centers, and as you were talking about before, sovereignty in the governmental sense, that we're a European company, we don't want to be using American cloud providers stored in the U.S. How does that element of sovereignty around AI relate to what you're describing?
It very, very much has been the first stance when people think of sovereignty is think about infrastructure. I think McKinsey also helped us do the job very effectively on talking about sovereignty. They released a report a couple of weeks before, I think earlier in January, when they talked about three layers of sovereignty. One, to your point, is infrastructure, where the most amount of capex is, because you have to not just provide for the chips and the infrastructure to build the sovereign data center, but you also need to be able to power it and then cool it. So it is companies, many big investment funds like G42 that are building this, but also different organizations in different nation states that are providing the space for that data center build, and also the electricity needed to fuel it. To the point that India also made the use of nuclear power private to be able to provide electricity to the data center. So different countries have been doing a lot, and sovereignty when it comes to infrastructure has been a big topic for the last year and a half since President Trump came to power. I think that became a big topic for most nations. But when it comes to building your own models and building your own data, people recognized, and a lot of the states recognized that even if they have their infrastructure, if they are still using a Chinese model, if still using an American frontier model, they are not totally sovereign. So it came with the process. First, you have the infrastructure, then you have the data, then you build the models. And a big proof point to it was also been last week when UAE, that has been the biggest creator of sovereign infrastructure, also released their first sovereign domain model. So from their university in Abu Dhabi. So that is also a proving point that nations that have been on the forefront of building sovereign infrastructure are also now thinking about the next layers, which is the data and the models, which is what we built at Ekta.
Where ultimately do you see the dividing line between where these general purpose, big foundation models will get used and the more domain specific sovereign models? 'Cause obviously there's some level of trade-off, as you said, there certainly are situations where you're better off with a smaller and more focused model. But how do you see the world of AI dividing?
Um, unlike many other technologies where enterprise is first and humans are individuals and citizens are later, right? We've been part of the evolving evolution of technology over years. So when all these different amazing technologies, even when AI ML came in, right? Big banks, big organizations like Amazon had access to that. And
Mm.
we as individuals or small and medium-sized enterprise did not feel the benefit of what AI ML could do. Right? It's just in the hands of how you do scoring, how do you identify fraudulent transactions, how do you do surveillance on fraud, and all that good stuff was in the hands of bigger organization. It's for the first time with Gen AI that the power has been more in the hands of the individuals, and
Mm.
that has been a really big reason why we see the euphoria on Gen AI like never before. I mean, we have seen euphoria on blockchain before. We keep getting frenzy for quantum computers, but never at the same altitude that we have seen this for AI to happen, because now we are seeing the individuals, the power of what AI can do. So the bigger frontier LLMs would continue to capture the massive domestic markets, the massive retail
Mhm.
market that
Mhm.
exists. And there are lots of markets in terms of language arbitration. If you just look at India, so many different languages, so many different states that still needs penetration. If you look at the entire African continent, they don't have anything as a frontier model of their own. So there's a huge capacity for the bigger frontier model to continue to keep making that penetration into the retail market. But when it comes to enterprise, good enough is not good enough. And you need to be able to get almost 100% accuracy. And you should be able to have economies to run these models for you to actually start showing benefits of AI. Because so far it's costs, it's not benefits. And in order to show benefits, you need economies, and then you need to be able to run the models also at a price point that is viable for the business. And that's where we see a big amount of domain specific models making foray into the enterprise area. Having said that, I'm sure the bigger enterprise will continue to keep playing with the frontier models, and the OpenAIs and the Anthropics and the Mistrals of the worlds will continue to keep evolving to cater to the enterprise. But we do see ourselves about $500 billion target addressable market for domain-specific models, for sovereign models that are much more cost-effective and can do the job that they're assigned to. So they might not be able to say who won the Australian Open yesterday, but they can totally do the work that you have assigned them to do in your specific domain.
Mhm. And just broadly, one of the things that I've always been concerned about in the dialogue in recent years about digital sovereignty more broadly, and this is primarily on the government side as opposed to the private models that you're talking about, is that it's a fragmented vision. That if we have a world where we have this technology which is inherently global, which can draw on people and information across the entire world, but we wind up implementing it in a way that just boxes it into individual nation states or even individual groups within nation states, then I worry that there's something lost. There's both technically in terms of interoperability, but also in terms of shared awareness and communication. Um, is that a concern in the area of sovereign AI?
I think from a sovereignty perspective, I always give that answer, right? If you're making and coming in from a banking
Mhm.
background, right? And that's the conundrum we always had with the fintech doing blockchain, where you have open access to everything. Every transaction is known to everyone on the blockchain versus the Swift transactions that we all have to deal with. It's messy, it's difficult, it's very opaque in nature. But you would not want your transactions to be known to everyone. Who are you transacting with? Who you're sending money to? So there's certain use cases, even for a bank, that remains to be very private, that remains to be very accurate, cost effective. That's the universe that is very apt for domain specific models. And there are going to be use cases that needs to be interoperative. Different banks can talk to each other, the cross border transactions, and that's where those are the kind of use cases which would continue to be very, very adaptive for LLMs and bigger frontier models to deal with. But you do not have one size fit all for every solution. And from a regulatory perspective, right, the regulators would not feel comfortable for bigger frontier models to be good enough because they cannot say, did you follow the best practice? The regulators need to know, can you prove what your AI did, why it did it, and who authorized it? And unfortunately, large language models and frontier models cannot answer yes to any of those three questions.
Mhm.
So for Gen AI to become regulatory approved, compliant, accountable, you need to have control over what you're building, what you're training it with, and who authorized it. And that cannot be done for the large language models. So, by default, domain specific models will have to be the play if the enterprises have to benefit from the Gen AI frenzy.
Yeah, this ties back to what you mentioned at the beginning, the connection to accountability, because we've had a lot of debate in legal forums and regulatory forums around AI where something goes wrong at the end of the process. And the question is, well, should you regulate the one who's deploying that particular system or should you regulate the model developer? And they both have a point. The user of that large language model says, "Well, I don't control what's going into ChatGPT," and
Exactly.
OpenAI says, "I don't control what people are doing with ChatGPT."
Exactly.
So it sounds like what you're describing is potentially a way to overcome that problem.
Exactly. Because, I mean, coming in from banking, the biggest department that is extremely regulated is the model risk management. Right, they are very, definitive set of algorithms. They're not probabilistic; they're very deterministic in nature. But each of these models that are used in banking and how you do trading, how do you do fraud detection, and the likes, are governed with these model regulations. And none of the Gen AI models can be regulated in the MRM spectrum because it's probabilistic. That's number one, because they're
Mm.
large language models. And if they're not even built by you and you have no control of what data was fed and how the decisions are being made, it will never pass through MRM. And as much as I found the MRM to be a huge friction for all the good stuff we wanted to implement. I understand the value of why this is important, because if you are responsible for the citizens, for the money that you hold on account of your citizens and for your clients, all of these regulations are extremely important to make sure that you're doing the right thing. So if you are in the regulated industry, I do believe that this would not be an option, but a must have to be able to understand what your models do, and you can make the model accountable or the model builder accountable for what comes out of it, just the way we do it for MRM in the deterministic algorithms in the banks today.
One other thing I want to ask you about is that I understand you've been engaged in some of the efforts that the Vatican has been doing around AI ethics and governance. And Pope Leo has spoken a lot since becoming Pope about AI. So can you talk about the pieces of that you've engaged with and what role can a religious leader have in this area?
It's an excellent question. My co founder has been a big part of that exercise, working with the previous Pope, but I think our engagement was more with the Chancellor of the Academy of Sciences. And they have been a spokesperson on the fact that AI has to be accountable, as exactly the ethics of your podcast. And the control on who is building the models and who's running the model cannot be in the hands of the few, which is what the church does say, because church of the people. I think our relationship with them is more in terms of, the ethics and the principles on which AI should be developed, and that is what we do under the guidance of the Chancellor of Academy of Sciences. So we have done some work in terms of getting to a point where benchmarks could speak to the brand alignment, because you can imagine the brand alignment for church is extremely important. It cannot have a woke American model, woke frontier model, so to say, to speak on its behalf. So a lot of work that we have done in that space is more in terms of understanding what is accountability all about. How do you add in the ethics and the governance that
Mm.
POPs is responsible for with regards that set of alignment, and that we could loop in and build it into our platform. So it's been a very exciting set of relationship, because we feel that we're trying to bring in the ethics from a brand alignment perspective, and one of the brands that has passed every test of time is the brand of the church.
Yeah, it's fascinating how you pull these different pieces together because I often remark that there's conversations about AI ethics, there's conversations about AI governance, there's conversations about risks, there's conversations about regulation, and there's conversations about brand and business needs. And I try to frame accountability as something that cuts across them. But it's really interesting the way that you see all these pieces coming together, and the sovereign models really being at the center of it.
Oh, that's fascinating. That's why I'm very excited about bringing Ekta to life. And after having worked in banks and regulated industry, I do understand the need with which we built the Ekta 4. And also with my co-founder's experience, it just is extremely important that unlike many other competitors of ours who are very much aligned in the academics and the research side of things, what we are trying to build with Ekta is the experience side of things, right? So if you've experienced building a huge platform that's sovereign from the times in early 2020s when sovereign AI wasn't a thing to actually having experience building MRM and regulated industry, what exactly does the industry need in order for it to accept as a model, get it convinced, get it approved by the regulators, get it approved by the compliance to put it into play? Otherwise, unfortunately, we see ourselves in the same conundrum when it comes to enterprise. I always say us as in the enterprise to just experiment and pilot and see what's the art of the possible. And the most use cases that we have seen from enterprise is internal information, right? Can you answer questions on what information is stored where for your internal employees? It has not been deployed into a lot of mission critical topics and use cases because of this very reason. So that's where we feel that we can help support a lot of enterprise, a lot of sovereigns to be compliant, to be regulated, rightfully so, because then you could answer the question of who's accountable for this AI.
Tanvi, thank you so much for this conversation.
Thank you, Kevin. My pleasure.
This has been The Road to Accountable AI. If you like what you're hearing, please give us a good review and check out my Substack for more insights on AI accountability. Thank you for listening. If you want to go deeper on AI governance, trust, and responsibility with me and other distinguished faculty of the world's top business school, sign up for the next cohort of Wharton's Strategies for Accountable AI online executive education program, featuring live interaction with faculty, expert interviews, and custom-designed asynchronous content. Join fellow business leaders to learn valuable skills you can put to work in your organization. Visit execed.wharton.upenn.edu/ACAI for full details. I hope to see you there.